It secures that money from other interests that might want it for operational purposes. We're going into collective bargaining right now. That helps ensure that that money's insulated for capital or for emergency purposes and not just for handing out big raises or providing, good benefits. The other thing it does is it helps us ensure that we have money in reserve for capital items. We just spent a great deal of money to construct the roads, and it's a beautiful facility. But at some point in time, it's going to wear out. What are we doing to ensure that we have some amount of money in reserve so when the day comes, we're not borrowing 100% of what we need to replace or update that facility. We're borrowing a little bit, right? So that is what this document can help us do to help council. The other thing it can is support the city's position in addressing operational decision-making and priority.
You want to advance your slides?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm talking. There we go. Forecast, consider recommendations. The other thing is define expectations on infrastructure investments and priorities. So right now, we are fortunate to have the resources to be able to continue to put in significant amounts of money into the public infrastructure for the community's benefit. Based on what I've showed you tonight, clearly there's going to become a time when the availability of those resources is going to be limited. How can we prepare in advance for when that happens? How can we start messaging to the public? How can we start looking at alternative ways to, again, expand those dollars? Right? So we're putting $1.5 million every year into local street resurfacing. We're paying cash. Well, what if we went out and we borrowed that money instead? And we borrowed that money and we paved a bunch of roads at one time. We paid them down over 10 years. The useful life of the road is 15. So we've cleared up some cash to do provide additional services or provide some unique experiences for our citizens. We're still being able to meet those capital needs. And then when those roads need to be repaired, the note's paid off, we do it again, right? We've made that money go further, right? So this document would be able to help provide us guidance. So again, we could provide you guidance. And then the other thing is this policy would be able to help us on matters of debt issuance, cash management, and investment principles. Jim deserves some credit. I want to give him. He's done a great job managing the city's money, and we've been able to make a nice chunk of change from the benefits of those investments. But we have to have money available to keep in those investments. You also heard me reference earlier in the conversation that we have a lot of spikes. We have a lot of peaks and valleys in our budget as we pay cash for this, and it goes away from the budget, and then we have this project, and so there's a lot of this. The policy would allow us or provide us guidance to keep all of those three items kind of more in line with one another. There would be hills and valleys as opposed to mountainous peaks and chasmous troughs. So we'd want to try and stable those out. Now, the other thing that this would be able to do is it would allow council not only to justify its decisions when it comes to explaining to the public and when it comes to explaining to interested parties why it's making some of the decisions that it's making, it would also ensure that council, or at least the majority of council, is like-minded when it votes to amend or when it would vote to make exceptions to those policies, right? So you better have a gosh darn good reason as to why all of a sudden we're going to break from our tradition of practice X to do Y, right? And so it's a method to keep accountability both to council amongst yourselves, but to the citizens about why the government is making the decisions it's making on fiscal policy. So my apologies for talking faster than I was advancing, but that is this presentation in a nutshell. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions, as is Jim or the city manager, about what you've heard tonight or some of the thoughts and considerations that we put into to putting this model together. Again, this is our first cut at this. We expect this to be an annual item that we will bring before council in advance of the budget. And the longer that, again, we work together, the more time we have to work with this living, breathing document that is our budget. We will continue to improve the forecast. But please keep in mind that ultimately we are going to find ourselves in a position where we cannot continue our financial business as usual practice, and we are going to have to consider how and when we're going to land this aircraft to make sure we can fuel it up, get it back in the air, and get everybody to where they're going safely. So With that, Mr. Mayor, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have on this issue.
First of all, thank you. Appreciate it very much. It was a great presentation. Let us know kind of where we're at, what we're looking for, and what's down the road. So certainly appreciate that. I just have, really one question. It might seem small detail, but when we talk about, you said continued property tax revenue decline of about 1.2% annually. Are we seeing that now? I guess because I realize what the city receives about 5.5 cents on the dollar in terms of actual property tax. It's not much revenue that we get, but it's still revenue.
Sure.
But I guess there's
it's a decline in the actual valuation. Our collections might be different because obviously we're getting more structures built, which would offset that. But I believe that percentage is based on the trend of the actual valuations that an individual property would see that rate, not an overall revenue collection number.
The trend is based on receipted income to the city in those areas.
Right.
The trend starts from 2008 and is based on an overall decline. Again, so this is averages from what is 2008 through 2017. Now, there's an increase in, I believe it is 18. That's a result of the sesquicentennial
Anyway, it was the triennial. And that's the reason the question I asked, because we saw a presentation by Carl Keith where they did that assessment, and I think just about every municipality, every region, except for I think they said Jefferson Township, saw like about a 4% increase.
Correct.
So I'm just trying to understand what I've heard there. If it was a triennial audit that was done in 2017, I'd expect that to be coming around again soon. So I'm just trying to understand why. I'm just trying to understand the two.
Okay, so there's a couple reasons for the trend, that at least why we believe the trend is going to continue forward. Okay, so the first assumption, which is that all of the development that we have seen in recent years, the vast majority of all the development that we have seen in the majority of years is occurring within the tax increment finance districts. So that revenue is going into those funds to support whatever expenses are assigned to those funds. So while there may be overall positive growth within the city of Huber Heights, the benefit of that growth is going into the tax increment finance districts, which is why when we see receipted income and property tax, that income is coming from all of the areas outside of the tax increment finance districts. Okay. So we're seeing positive growth in our property tax. We're seeing positive growth in investment in property in Huber, but we're seeing it in areas that are specifically capturing that growth for a specific purpose. So in theory, 25 years from now, we're going to see a big, huge dump into the tax roll when all of the property and all of the development that is in the TIF dissolves, and all of that revenue will then show up on the conventional tax roll when the TIF expires. So that's number one. The other reason that we believe that we're seeing the number that we see is that the run in the housing market is in new housing. And so value is growing in newer housing. So for instance, when you look at Lexington Place Phase 1, overall value just in Lexington Place grew, now this includes what occurred through the recession, grew by about 2% over a 10-year period. So, but that's newer housing compared to many of the areas that are paying the property tax here. So effectively, what's happening is all boats rise on the tide, even the leaky ones, right?
Right.
So because our older housing stock is not in demand, it's getting a natural lift because just by the very nature that new housing is growing and is in demand and brings higher value. But at some point in time, if I still want to sell my older home to buy a newer home, chances are I'm willing to take a smaller profit margin, right? Because I've paid down a greater rate of equity, on that property. And so that's why we believe that trend will continue. Now, That's only based on previous trend data and one revaluation that showed positive value since the end of the recession. So, again, based on former data. So once we get the next set of triennial numbers from the county, we might change this assumption. But the assumption is based on what we've seen previously.
Okay. Makes perfect sense. I just want to make sure that if we had anybody watching, I just don't want to understand the difference between value and actual receipted income off of that. I don't want our residents panicking, thinking, "Oh my God, are they saying my property values are going to drop?" So I just want to make sure that there's a clear distinction between that.
Right.
Okay. But thank you for taking the time to explain that.
Sure.
And again, the assumptions are very fundamental, just like that being an example. So, and that's what you've got to do to establish a trend. There's all sorts of variables, and as Brian said, fine print that applies direct to our situation. But looking generally to come up with a forecast, you've got fundamental assumptions, and that's an example where fundamentally based on that, but the value of that income overall has increased because we've got increased funds into the revenue that is paying for the districts that are seeing the improvements in that. So but fundamentally just looking at the property tax receipts, that's a result of that. So to look at that particular segment of this forecast and the way that we wanted to design this was to take it to the fundamental level and then start building in the fine print applicability to our particular situation on top of those fundamentals, if that makes sense.
Nope. So, makes perfect sense. Right. I just want to make sure we're not I don't want to just throw people into a panic that their property values are going to start going down.
Sure, and as you'll see as we get into the numbers part of things too, some of these assumptions, we mentioned the capital. That is if we paid cash for everything that's in the capital plan. So obviously that's a huge chunk. So if you look at that as a fundamental assumption moving forward, that's what those trends show. Now, again, by design of policy, for instance, there was a sudden increase in would it be a capital expenditure, for instance, the water plant or the water softening. That causes a huge spike that we talked about. But if you factor that in and keep that as a trend, obviously that's not sustainable. So as we get into the numbers thing, that will certainly help spell some of that out. But as we've said, and as we've talked the last few years, we want to identify as part of the 2025 plan to make sure that we are sustainable and we are ready to evaluate the sustained finances for the city, and that's what we need to do is look in that forecast out, not just in a 12-month period, but on. Real quick, also, I wanted to add in the discussion alternative funding, and that's also part of what we're talking about when we look at, but it's not part of the assumptions because we can't count on it. And one of the things we always hear, let's get a grant for this, let's get a grant for that. Those are awesome opportunities. However, we need to be mindful and careful not to create projects just because a grant opportunity exists, because now what we've done is we've added an expenditure of a match or an expenditure of ancillary costs, maintenance, upkeep, etc., to something that wasn't necessarily planned. So the grant might have provided some funding, but overall it's ended up costing us more if we didn't need or wanted to at that time take on that project. So that's all part of that policy type of thing that we want to build in. There's two opportunities coming up that I know there's some discussion about. Dayton Development Coalition has done a good job of marketing and sending out and making it look like, hey, there's all sorts of free money here. We're dying for projects. Please send us your request so we can fund in the PDAC process. And that is a very good process, the Priority Development Advocacy Committee through the Dayton Development Coalition. And that's basically the state legislators' way to pass off some capital budget inclusions in the capital budget. So the PDAC process is something that we this year have an opportunity to look at, and the monies requested through that requires the building of something, but it also excludes things that there are already state-defined monies and allocations within the state budget for, such as road money, bridge money, facilities money, etc. That have water, sewer, and all those things that have those separate processes. So. One of the examples of things that we are looking at regarding potential projects, it always requires a regional or a collaborative approach. To have, for instance, and I know Brian provided this example earlier when we were looking at this process, if we wanted to put a $50,000 playground into a park, PDAC's likely not even going to look at that. It's single sourced. It's a project only for the community. However, if we were to look at